Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. It has been 1 year since the devastating attack by Hamas on Israel. We are asking you, how has the Middle East crisis over the last year affected you? We'll hear from varied perspectives on this. We'll speak with two political scientists, a retired U.S. general, as well as Vancouver's honorary consul for Lebanon, who is in Beirut. At the end of the show, we'll talk to Brian Scudamore, founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK. He's the newest dragon on Dragon's Den on CBC. We'll chat about his secret to success. I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Today marks 1 year since the October 7th attack by Hamas, considered the worst attack on the Jewish community since the Holocaust. On that day, some 1,200 people were killed, 250 people taken hostage, with at least 70 who have died since. And that's according to Israeli media. Among the dead were several Canadian citizens. Later on, we'll hear from Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly on her statement on today's grim anniversary. And today, memorials are being held in Israel and in Canada, and here in Vancouver as well, including this past weekend.
We're here to extend solidarity to Palestinian people who've been victims of a year-long siege on Gaza that has killed tens of thousands of people.
There's an error in that clip. We were meaning to show someone who was at a Jewish memorial this past weekend. There were, though, also pro-Palestinian protests, demonstrations at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and that clip is from that event. We'll play that later on in the show as well. Now, the last year since the attack by Hamas has brought Israel's retaliatory campaign on Gaza, which has now killed an estimated 41,500 people, according to Palestinian health authorities. And the conflict in the Middle East has intensified and expanded. We are asking you, how has the Middle East crisis over the last year affected you? Now, we'd like to hear from you on the open line. We are having technical difficulties with our 1-800 number today, but you can call us on our 604 number. That is 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690. Aurel Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto and an associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. I spoke with him earlier today. What are your reflections on the attacks of October 7th, 2023?
We really need to go back to the context. This was an attack by Hamas. It was a ceasefire on October 6th. The attack was brutal to an extent that was almost unimaginable. President Biden said that this was worse than ISIS. It traumatized Israel. It created the conditions where any state had to take action to make sure that this is not repeated. The leaders of Hamas stated that if given a chance, they would do this over and over again. Just today, the leader of Iran celebrated this massacre by saying that this set back the Zionist entity by 70 years. So we can see that this was not only Hamas, but this was something coordinated, that it involved Iran, which is the largest supporter of terrorism in the world. It involved the next day, on October 8th, an attack with a large number of rockets by Hezbollah in the north, and it continues with attacks by the Houthis. So we can see that this is a local conflict, this is a regional conflict, and in any conflict, the loss of any innocent life is a tragedy. But we also must look at causes. We must look at who started this conflict. Would it be continuing if Hamas would stop, if Hezbollah would have stopped its rocket fire, if Iran would change its policy, which very openly calls for the utter destruction of Israel?
The magnitude of this conflict is very difficult to capture. Can you tell me a bit about what impact October 7th and the year since has had on the sense of security among Israelis?
Obviously, it has created enormous trauma. And as it was pointed out, there are still hostages that are being held, that are held in the most horrific conditions, where there are indications that the women have been raped, that others have been tortured, that they have been threatened with executions, that Sinwar Yahya Sinwar, who's the leader of Hamas currently, has basically played a very clever, ruthless, and a thoroughly painful, in every possible way, psychological game using these hostages. And so we have to ask ourselves, what would any other country do? And when we look at Israeli actions, yes, Hamas claims that something like 41,000 people have died. That is the Hamas Ministry of Health. But of those, not just Israelis, but intelligence services state that close to half were actually Hamas terrorists. And we must remember that Hamas is deemed to be a terrorist organization in Canada and virtually everywhere in the Western world.
And half of those reported deaths are reportedly women and children. When it comes to Israel's retaliation, the Canadian government acknowledges Israel's right to defend itself. As you note, as you know, I'm sure there's debate over whether that response has been disproportionate. What do you make of that?
There's always a debate, but we have to ask, was United disproportionate when they helped liberate Mosul? What was the situation in the case of Canada's action in Afghanistan? What was the response that we had in the former Yugoslavia when Milosevic and his forces committed genocide at Srebrenica? And so in any military action, obviously there will be tragic loss of life. But intent is what is crucial. Intent makes the difference between tragedy and barbarism. And this is what we must remember, that Hamas, that Hezbollah, that Iran, they would do this over and over again, and they said so. They celebrated these deaths. This is what makes a difference between a democracy, and any democracy would defend itself, and terrorist movements. So we have to be very careful when we use these kind of terms in international law, what is proportionate, and what can be done in terms of defense.
What do you make of the humanitarian crisis that has been declared in Gaza?
Any conflict has humanitarian aspects, but vast quantities of food, medicine have been delivered. You will notice that there has been a large program of vaccinating children against polio. There will be a second round. There's no perfect solution. So anyone who thinks that there is some kind of magical surgical operation, that somehow one could write a threatening letters to the leaders of Hamas and they would desist, we have to live in a world where conflict, sadly, is endemic, where the forces of aggression, whether it's North Korea or Russia or Iran, are on the march. And this is not only about Israel. Iran has much larger goals than just Israel. And we cannot just look at Gaza in isolation. We have to understand that Iran is heavily involved, that Hamas has been in many ways a proxy of Iran, that there's an ongoing conflict, that even today Hamas fired rockets towards Israel.
And there has been Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why I think the Canadian Foreign Minister said that Israel has a right to defend itself. And we can't say on the one hand they have a right to defend themselves, but they cannot use force. So it is a very fine line. And if anyone thinks that they have a magical solution, they should come out and clarify what is that magical solution. How do you defend yourself, but you only use surgical strikes, and there are no casualties among civilians, especially when Hamas is known widely by every Western intelligence source to use their civilians as human shields. They built tunnels to hide their weapons. They didn't build shelters to protect their people.
Let's bring it back to the victims on October 7th. I guess, what is the message to the victims, the families, and their supporters in terms of whether there is going to be an end to this conflict that today is intensifying and expanding?
It is a horrible condition for all those whose loved ones and the Israelis, the Canadians, who are being held, who were kidnapped, who were utterly innocent civilians by Hamas. And if Hamas would surrender and release those hostages, that conflict would be over in Gaza. And no one has come up with a solution that has been able to resolve this. And this is why we see this conflict continuing. I think we need to understand the complexity of terrorism. We need to understand the complexity of power when international law and international institutions do not work. All we have to do is to look at what happened in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. The United Nations has been absolutely impotent. And this is the situation here as well. And this is why that in the absence of international law, in the absence of effective international institutions, what do countries do when they're attacked? How do we cope with terrorism? How do we deal with an Iran that wishes to become a nuclear power and is using these proxies? It's using the people of Gaza. It's using the people of Lebanon. It's using the people of Yemen as tools to pursue their own fanatical goals.
And what about Prime Minister Netanyahu? What will it take for him? There have been, proposals for ceasefires. What will it take for him to accept one?
At the moment, according to the Americans, the Israeli government has, in principle, accepted this ceasefire, but for a number of weeks now, they have not received anything from Yahya Sinwar. They cannot communicate directly with him, so it's in the hands of Hamas. Mr. Netanyahu is a flawed leader, and clearly he will bear responsibility for not preparing Israel adequately, and he is likely to lose the next election. That's what happens in a democracy. And so he is accountable to the people of Israel, and the people of Israel will pass judgment on how well he has done and how this conflict ends.
Professor Braun, it's very good to speak with you on this grim anniversary. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Aurel Braun is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto and associate of the Davis Center at Harvard University. We do have that clip now from the memorial on Sunday.
The reason I'm here is because my family was kidnapped. My cousin Tal is still a hostage in Gaza. I'm very fortunate that 6 of them escaped and got out in the November exchange. There were 2 children, aged 3 and 8 years old, Yahel and Nave. And they're scarred for life from their experience, and that was, only a month in captivity, and these children are PTSD probably for the rest of their lives.
We have more coming up here on BC Today. It's 12:19 Pacific Time. And events have been taking place across Canada today to mark the October 7th anniversary. Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism is in Toronto. Mikhail Kotler-Wunsch spoke at an event organized by the United Jewish Appeal Federation of Greater Toronto.
I am here as Israel's Special Envoy because the very same anti-Semitism that fueled the atrocities of October the 7th, that murdered and raped and butchered and abducted, is the anti-Semitism that fuels the responses to those atrocities, those war crimes, those crimes against humanity. Responses of silence, me too, unless you're a Jew. Responses of denial, even as those barbaric savages live-streamed their atrocities on that day. Responses of justification, rape as armed resistance, and responses that attack Jews around the world, online, on the streets, on campuses, including right here in Canada, as a response to the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust.
That's Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, Michal Kotler-Wunsch, speaking earlier. (12:21) now. This past Saturday, pro-Palestinian demonstrators gathered at the Vancouver Art Gallery.
We're here to extend solidarity to Palestinian people who've been victims of a year-long siege on Gaza that has killed tens of thousands of people, including tens of thousands of children. And that we see no attempt by the part of authorities in Canada to bring this to an end.
We are having large gatherings like this because people are coming to terms with their consciousness, seeing the death toll, seeing the destruction, and they're saying this needs to end, this needs to stop.
We are taking your calls asking, how has the Middle East crisis over the past year affected you? The number that is working today is 604-669-3733. We're joined now by Hani Ferris, adjunct professor at UBC's Political Science Department and author of the book, The Failure of the Two-State Solution, The Prospects of One State in the Israel-Palestine Conflict. And Professor Ferris joins me here in our studio. Good afternoon.
Hello, Michelle. How are you?
I am doing fine, and thank you so much for joining us. What are your own reflections of this grim anniversary?
Well, I'm fortunate to have to listen to your first two visitors. They gave the classical Israeli Zionist explanation for what happened. And I think your audience has to be very careful about what to accept and what to reject. Let's begin by discussing how the Palestinians and Israelis look at the October 7 incidents. To the Israeli, October 7 is the starting point, and it's the explanation for everything that has happened since. It's very unfortunate that this kind of a view neglects the whole history of the Palestinian issue, neglects the policies of the Israeli government and the ideologies of Zionism. To the Palestinians, this is one of several fights that they've had with the Israelis since 2005, when the Israelis left the Gaza Strip, the inside of the Gaza Strip, and simply surrounded the Palestinians with a huge wall, not allowing them to go out or go in, controlling what they can eat, what they can drink, where they can go, where they can't go. This is a population now of about 13 million, the Palestinians. Of these, about 7 live in historic Palestine, and the others are distributed all over the Middle East and the world. This is a population that has seen so much in its modern history. Just to give you an example, in 1948, the Israelis killed more than 15,000, destroyed over 550 villages and towns in Palestine, populated by Palestinians, and threw them outside of historic Palestine. The people of Gaza, for example, 70% or more of them are registered with the United Nations as refugees. Now, Palestinians, refugees in Palestine, how is that? These Palestinians were living in southern Palestine, on the shoreline and in the interior. And they were forcefully thrown out, ethnically cleansed from their houses, from their towns, from their villages, from their lands. And they have lived in misery since then. Now, what happened in October is that Palestinians say after 2005, we had the following clashes with the Israelis: 2009, 2014, 2018, 2021. And 23 was one of these clashes. In 14, for example, in 2014, Michelle, the Israelis killed over 2,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Most of them were civilians. We're talking about the tragedy of October 7, and 1,100 Israelis were killed. You're talking about 24...
Well. And hostages were taken as well.
Hostages were in addition to those killed. Yes. So you had about 250 hostages.
Yes.
But those killed were about 1,100. So in 2014, I'm saying, over 2,000 Palestinians were killed, civilians mostly. Now, so the tragedy is on both sides. We don't need to have alligator's tears.
It is absolutely a tragedy
of course.
For all who have been affected. I wonder what your thoughts are, though, on the security of Israel when there are ongoing threats to its existence. We do hear that they have the right to defend themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this notion of defend yourself. What? Defend yourself against who? How? And for how long? In both Gaza and now in Lebanon, Israeli army is pursuing what they call the Dahiya doctrine. Dahiya doctrine was developed by the Israeli army in 2006. In 2006, they attacked Lebanon, and they destroyed major portions of the capital, Beirut, especially in the southern area. Just to give you an example, in one Hart Hareik neighborhood, they destroyed over 250 high-rise buildings by civilians. And what happened? 3,000 units of residential in these 250. That's just in one neighborhood. So they call this the doctrine of the Dahiya. And what does it mean? This doctrine was developed by the Israeli general, Godi Eisenkot, who was the head of the northern frontier. He was in charge of the northern frontier. And he said, we will exercise disproportionate violence on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So nobody will ever dare to raise a hand against Israeli atrocities. And that's what they did in Gaza and doing it now in Lebanon. Just, Michelle, for 1 second. In Gaza, more than 42,000 people have been killed and about 10,000 killed under the wrecks. They can't even take them out because they don't have the machinery and they're not allowed to take them out. So you're talking about mostly 52,000. And then you have more than 95,000 injured, many of them seriously injured. So this is a tragedy of high proportions. So when somebody gives me tears about 1,000 killed, but doesn't give a damn about more than 100,000 civilians killed and butchered, that doesn't make sense, Michelle.
Professor Ferris, may I ask you, this is obviously very emotional. It's very emotional for our audience, for the communities here in Canada as well. We're going to hear from the Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, in a moment about Canada's response or Canada's approach to this. But what then do Canadian leaders, UN leaders, the international community need?
We need to resolve it. One of the problems, you're talking about a whole 1 year now complete of war. And what has happened since? It's not any better, it's much worse than it was in October 7th. Now you have a war on multi-front war, not just one single frontier. You also have a war that is now extended to the whole region of the Middle East, including a major power like Iran, which is over 87 million people. And now you're involving others. It's just to give you an idea, 2 days ago, President Macron of France made a very important statement. He said publicly, we have to stop giving Israel arms because they're using the arms to kill civilians. And this has to be stopped. Of course, the Israelis didn't like it. But why would the president of France say it if he doesn't believe it and sees it with his own eyes? So it's very important that the United Nations Security Council moves along and finds a plan. A plan was developed a few months ago. Israel refused to apply it, and problems began to arise. So we're still going on, and we have nothing in front of us for raising our hope that the war would stop, that the killing would stop, that a solution to the tragedies of the Palestinian society be attended to. And as Biden said, hopefully we will be able to develop a two-state system in historic Palestine that could cause a peaceful solution.
That's what Canada is calling for as well. Can I ask you, there's division here in Canada. There has been a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, a rise in Islamophobia. What can be done as people grapple with this tragedy, this conflict in the Middle East that is only escalating? What can we do here to bridge the divide among communities?
But just to make a note, Michelle, it's not Jews versus Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims. There are many Jews who disagree with the policies of Israel. I'm a member of a Jewish society, the JVP, and I feel proud of it. I'm not a Jew.
Jewish Voices for Peace, I believe.
That's right, JVP. So we have to be careful. Not all Jews agree to what Israel is doing. And there's a good majority that does not accept the massacres that Israel is doing, the genocide that's happening in Gaza, and now another genocide happening in Lebanon. I mean, or on the way to happen. So what we as a people, as a population, as Canadians, if there's any merit to our country and its policies historically, it's the fact that it is peaceful society and looks for peaceful resolution of international conflict. I mean, all our prime ministers in the 50s and 60s and 70s adopted that kind of a position. And we now have to do the same. We have to ensure that a ceasefire takes place in both Lebanon and in Gaza. The United Nations and the great powers begin to look for a reasonable resolution of the conflict, and hopefully our future children and in the future will see more peace in that area.
Professor Ferris, thank you so much for coming. It's good to hear from you on this day as well.
Thank you, Michelle.
You take care. That is Hani Ferris, who's adjunct professor at UBC's Political Science Department, author of the book, The Failure of the Two-State Solution, The Prospects of One State in the Israel-Palestine Conflict. It's 12:35 now. This is BC Today here on CBC, and we have been taking your calls on this, asking you about the impact on you of the Middle East crisis over the last year. And we'll go to Anton in Bowen Island and Tasha in Vancouver coming up right after the CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. NDP leader David Eby says comments by Conservative leader John Rustad apparently supporting the idea of Nuremberg-style trials for the health officials behind COVID-19 public health measures are shameful and bizarre. Eby says it was difficult to fathom his political rival comparing doctors, nurses, and public health officials who saved thousands of lives with Nazi war criminals. Rustad issued a statement saying any comparison of the Nuremberg trials or Nazi Germany to COVID health measures was unacceptable and disrespectful. The Vancouver Police Department says officers will be very visible throughout the city today to mark the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel. The VPD says officers will be positioned at strategic locations such as faith-based schools and places of worship. The force says several protests and demonstrations are expected, and there's an increased chance of volatility. And a man has been arrested after police say a van was intentionally set on fire just outside Vancouver City Hall last night. There was roughly 100 liters of gasoline inside in containers. No one was hurt, and the suspect's motivation remains unknown. And now the forecast on the north coast, mainly cloudy this afternoon with a high of 11, highs up to 17 and mainly cloudy in the Peace. In the central interior, showers with a high of 15, highs from 18 to 21 with sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, mainly sunny with a high of 20 and increasing cloudiness in Greater Victoria this afternoon, a mix of sun and cloud in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley with highs around 16. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome.
That is Robert Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Thank you for joining us here on BC Today on CBC Radio 1, CBC Television as well, and live streaming on the CBC News app. You can find us on CBC Vancouver's YouTube page as well and on our live streaming channel, CBC News BC. Now, remember, tomorrow is the BC election debate. BC NDP leader David Eby, Conservative leader John Rustad, and BC Green Party leader Sonia Furstenau will discuss topics important to British Columbians ahead of the provincial election, which is, of course, October 19th. The debate is scheduled for 6:30 to 8 p.m. tomorrow night. It will be moderated by Shachi Kurl, president of the Angus Reid Institute. And CBC will carry the debate live on CBC Television, CBC Radio 1, as well as on YouTube, TikTok, CBC Gem, and again, CBC News BC, which is a 24/7 streaming channel. If you want to get updates, just go to our website, cbc.ca/BC. The election debate tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Today marks the one-year grim anniversary of the October 7th attack by Hamas. And this morning, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly spoke to reporters.
1 year since innocent people were murdered in what constitutes the worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. We remember those who were murdered, all those who were injured, victims of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as those who were taken hostage. Among the innocent people killed on by Hamas, Canada mourns victims of our own. Judy Weinstein, Vivian Silver, Ben Mizrachi, Netta Epstein, Shir Georgi, Alexandre Luc, Adi Vital Kaplun, and Tiferet Lapido. I've been in touch with their loved ones over the last year, maybe here in Canada, also in Israel, particularly following the terrorist attack on the days after when I was there. It's been a year and innocent people are still being held hostage by Hamas. Canada will not stop calling for the immediate release of all hostages. This includes returning the bodies of those brutally killed while they were in captivity. We must all stand up to the rising tide of anti-Semitism and hate we see in our country that has only worsened since October 7th. We continue to condemn Hamas, a listed terrorist organization backed by Iran. Far too many innocent civilians, including women and children, have been killed in this conflict, and we continue to work tirelessly to bring back peace and security in the Middle East, particularly through a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace and security. Today, as we remember and reflect, let us not lose sight of our shared humanity.
That's Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly speaking this morning. Now let's take a call from Anton in Bowen Island. Hi there, Anton. Good afternoon.
Hi, Michelle.
Thanks very much for calling. And what are your thoughts today?
Your initial question was how has it changed?
Yes.
Since October 7th. I have to explain a few things about my family history. My grandfather was Jewish. Most of my family was killed. My maternal family was killed during the war. There were 3 survivors. And I was always loyal to my mom, through my mother, of course, who came damaged out of the war, very damaged. And I was always loyal to her, the idea of Israel. And but when last year happened, and Minister Selina Robinson, who had since resigned, spoke about that Palestine was a wasteland and was nothing there, then I realized, oh, that's what my mother used to say. And since then, how it changed my life is that I've become more, because I've never understood the conflict really. I thought, oh, they're just hating each other. These two groups of people, Palestinian people and Israelis, Zionists essentially. But since then, I've been started to read up on the conflict. And one of the books, The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, has been extraordinarily helpful in that it gives a view we hardly ever hear in the media or through what you just heard from Minister Joly, is the Palestine side of how things happened and what has happened since 1917, really. This is not about October 7th. This is what happened when Theodor Herzl wrote his the pamphlet, the Judenstaat, which means the Jewish state, the establishment of a Jewish state. And I've been in a conflict since my own family history because it's so horrible what Israel is doing, and I've started to understand that Israel is the colonial aggressor in this conflict. And it has been helped by, first were the Zionist guerrilla, then they were helped by the UK because it was UK mandate. Palestine came out of the Ottoman Empire, became basically a colony of the British, who suppressed the Palestinians and helped the Zionists to take over. And then that role was later taken over by the United States, as we see, because they're still sending bombs and ammunition to Israel to commit genocide in Gaza. I've great difficulty with what's happening there, and I've very great difficulty with how Western politicians and Western media are portraying what's happening there, saying that Hamas is an Iranian proxy when it was the West who brought down the 1953 democratic government because of Iran, because that government wanted to nationalize its oil production, and the U.S. and the British were against that. And so Iran is actually a product of our Western interference as well. And the whole area of Arabia, all the colonialism of France and the UK, it's being discussed in this book, and how that has influenced what has happened for Palestine and Palestinian people who have been treated so poorly for a very long time. And as someone who is Jewish, I see this as I make a clear distinction between Zionism and Jewish people. And as Professor Ferris said, that not all Jewish are supporting Israel in this at all. And it was very hard to go through what Professor Braun and the Special Convoy of Israel, Wunsch, were saying, and basically also the Minister Joly of Canada. Yeah, we can only come to peace if we acknowledge what has happened in Palestine over the last 100 years. And we see it continuously. I think especially Western governments see it as more battle or more war, and that's not how we're going to survive as humanity. We have to come to peace, and that's for me. That's a change that's happened over the years. That more war is not going to resolve this conflict at all, not at all.
Anton,
that's why
that's how it's affected you over the last year. I really appreciate your calling.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and it's difficult.
I can certainly hear it, and I appreciate your hanging on the line to speak with us as well. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That's Anton joining us from Bowen Island. For more on escalating Middle East tensions, and let's talk about the diplomatic efforts and where they stand now. We're joined by retired U.S. General Joseph Votel. He's now a Middle East Institute Senior Fellow on National Security. Good afternoon.
Hello, it's good to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. We are seeing an expansion of this conflict over the last weeks and today as well. How concerning is that from your perspective in the U.S.?
Well, yeah, thank you again for having me. I mean, I think the U.S. policy and certainly the communications from American leadership has been principally about that concern, about not widening the conflict. And of course, today on the first anniversary of the horrific events of October 7th, we see a wider war here. We see not only Israel engaged on at least 3 different fronts in Gaza and Lebanon and in the West Bank, but we also see exchanges between Israel and Iran, and we see the Houthis who are causing a lot of problems down in the Red Sea, and of course part of that is sending missiles up towards Israel. So we are very much find ourselves today in a wider conflict that I think the United States had hoped to avert when, in the days after October 7th last year.
What will it take to get to a ceasefire?
Well, it's gonna take a very disciplined and a very dedicated diplomatic effort, and there have been some significant efforts to date, as I'm sure your listeners are aware. There's been the United States and some others have been involved in the ceasefire negotiations for Gaza that have seemed to both move forward but wane in the current situation and not really been developed with that. I think the unfortunate aspect of this conflict right now is there are not a lot of good prospects for diplomacy. At some particular point, that will have to step to the forefront. But right now, none of the parties that are involved have seen it in their interest to try to move this more deliberately into a diplomatic track. And in short of that, I think what we can expect to see, unfortunately, is more fighting, more conflict throughout the region.
What do you see as a role for the United States here then?
Well, I think the United States, working with our partners in the region, with other global powers, is to continue to do everything we can to bring this conflict to a conclusion. That will be difficult. I don't think anybody underestimates the challenges associated with all of this, but I think the United States has to continue to play that role, even at the same time as we continue to be supportive of Israel defending itself. And I think that's a longstanding United States national security interest. I expect that it will be going forward. But I think it is certainly in our interest, and I think it's in the interest of everybody in the region, to include the parties that are engaged right now, to not allow a prolonged conflict to take place here.
Mr. Votel, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know that you're very busy these days.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Retired U.S. General Joseph Votel, now a Middle East Institute Senior Fellow on National Security. It is 12:50 now. This is BC Today, and we turn to Lebanon, and we're joined by Nick Kawaji, Lebanon's honorary consul to Vancouver, and he's in Abra, which is a village in southern Lebanon. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Kawaji.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you describe where you are and what the situation is like right now there?
I'm in the little village at the east of Saida. Saida is the capital of South Lebanon. We don't have a bombardment over our village, but we hear the whole night, all the drone over Lebanon. You hear it the whole night. You hear always the planes, the jet fighters going and coming and bombing in Beirut, in the south, even in the Bekaa. I think we need the sleeping pills to be able to sleep at night. I mean, dropping 73 tons of bombs a few days ago. It was heard in all Lebanon. A couple days, in 1 day, 1,000 bombardments on the south suburb of Beirut, and this area became a ghost city. It's kind of a regional war on a small geographic area. You have 1,200,000 displaced persons. You could see them on the street. I had to go last week to Beirut to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for some diplomatic meeting, and I witnessed people sleeping on the street, on the park, in the cars. And it's really something that you could not see it, you could not witness it. You have kids, babies, they don't have education, no milks, no diapers, no wipes, no Tylenol, no aspirin, no water. I mean, it's a very, very hard situation.
You actually live in Vancouver with your family here, and you had traveled back to Lebanon to renew your diplomatic passport. In terms of the timeline of events, what did you observe in terms of how quickly the situation escalated?
You know, when I came, I mean, 23 days ago, it was quiet. It was problem at the borders only. Like we get used to that. They shoot at Lebanon, Lebanon shoot at them. So we get used to that. It wasn't that intense. But now it became like kind of a regional war. You have now Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Israel, Lebanon, and it's kind of a regional war. They have to stop it. They have to work for a ceasefire right now. If not, it will become more and more, I mean, the war machine, it became more and more intense, and we'll be having a lot of lost life.
And you are actually scheduled to fly back home on Thursday. Are you optimistic about that? What are the challenges?
You know, I have to leave on Thursday morning. I already talked to a young guy that he knows the area, so to take me on the side road to try to get to the airport, because they bombed the road to the airport. They bombed it yesterday, I think. So, and I saw that the photo on the video. So the guy, he said he knows some small roads here and there, so he tried to take me there. And I hope on Thursday I will be taking the Lebanese plane to Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt to Vancouver.
How is your family doing?
You know, I missed my family. I missed my wife and my kids and my parents, and all my brothers and sisters are in Vancouver, in Port Moody area. And I missed my patient too. I'm a dentist, and I was supposed to be booked next week for patients. They are worried. I received tons of WhatsApp messages, emails. Come here, come back. What are you doing there? They don't know that I could not come back anytime I want. I am stuck to Thursday morning, taking the plane. Yes, they are worried. They are worried, and they know everything. Last week, they bombed a village not far from us, and 71 person was killed. So my daughter called me and said, they bombed not far from Abra. I said, no, it's very far. She said, hey, I know the area as you know it yourself. It's not far. So they know. I could not tell them, no, it's quiet. But for now, we are safe, in brackets, hoping we'll be out of here soon.
Thank you very much for joining us, and do stay safe. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a good night.
You too. Nick Kawaji is Lebanon's honorary consul to Vancouver. He works in Vancouver as a dentist. It is 12:55 now, and we will bring you our interview with Brian Scudamore, who is the newest dragon on Dragon's Den, tomorrow on the program. We'll speak with him tomorrow, as we made time for further guests and calls on this topic today. And do remember that tomorrow as well, we're going to talk more about the BC election, of course, because the election debate is tomorrow night. It will take place at 6:30 to 8 p.m. Pacific, and we'll air it on all CBC platforms, and you can get updates on cbc.ca/BC. Again, it starts at 6:30 p.m. You'll hear NDP leader David Eby, BC Conservative leader John Rustad, and BC Green Party leader Sonia Furstenau debating the biggest issues in this provincial election, which is, of course, October 19th. So stay informed and tune into that debate tomorrow. We'll carry it live on all platforms here on CBC. And as well, you can get updates throughout the evening as well on our website, cbc.ca/BC. This is BC Today. And do join us tomorrow on the show as well. We'll bring you continuing coverage of the provincial election. And tomorrow, in our second half hour at 12:30, we'll focus on the issue of disabilities and support for people with disabilities in this election. What are the disability issues that you would like to highlight? What are the needs for the disability community in this election?